for Mission and Identity, and I welcome you to this evening's program. The Office of Mission and Identity offers to our college community programs which we hope will stimulate reflection and discussion about topics and issues central to the mission of the College of New Rochelle. Tonight, we continue to explore dimensions of social justice, led by Dr. Amy Bass, Associate Professor of History and Director of the Honors Program in the School of Arts and Sciences. Dr. Bass received her BA in History from Bates College and Master's and Doctorate with distinction from Stony Brook University in History. She lectures widely in her areas of expertise: African American history, modern American culture, identity formations, and historical theory and methodology. She is published in the Journal of American History, the South Atlantic Quarterly, and is a regular columnist for Morphism, an arm of the Huffington Post. She authored Not the Triumph, but the Struggle, the 1968 Olympic Games and the Making of the Black Athlete, and edited In the Game, Race, Identity, and Sports in the 20th Century. Tonight's program, a collision of racism, patriotism, and global politics, derives from the themes which Dr. Bass has explored in her newest book about W.E.B. Du Bois. W.E.B. Du Bois, author, civil rights activist, Pan-Africanist, historian, was born in the small Massachusetts town of Great Barrington. Residents of the town recognized his talent, funded his education, and much later, after his death in 1963, proposed the creation of a memorial park in his name. Debate over this proposal bitterly divided the community and brought to light the complex intersection of global politics, racism, and Cold War patriotism. Dr. Bass will read from and speak on her new book, Those About Him Remained Silent, The Battle over W.E.B. Du Bois, demonstrating how debates over the legacy of Du Bois are increasingly relevant in contemporary American politics. Dr. Bass.
Thank you, Dr. Bailey, and thank you for arranging this really stimulating calendar of events from your office this semester. I'm really hoping I don't mess up your track record tonight and that we keep things stimulating and interesting. It would be interesting to think about what W.E.B. Du Bois, the architect of the modern civil rights movement and a co-founder of the NAACP, would say in a talk sponsored by the Office of Mission and Identity. The concept of social justice, which is one of the overarching tenets embedded in our college mission, had great appeal for Du Bois, a prolific thinker and writer who tried on just about every worldview created by humans, and when that didn't work, he invented a few of his own. To think about concepts of social justice, or as he often put it, social equity, as experienced by every aspect of society, rather than via administration of law, is something that he consistently espoused throughout each phase of his ideological evolution, which spanned some 9 decades. Indeed, his creation of Pan-Africanism was designed to serve as a third world movement for independence and social justice, expanding the ideals of the emerging civil rights movement in the United States to an international and internationalist perspective. Yet for many, Du Bois's quest for social justice ran afoul with his final worldview. At the age of 93, he joined the Communist Party and then expatriated himself to Ghana, where he died 2 years later on the eve of the March on Washington, August 1963. For many, Du Bois's official recognition of communism creates a contradiction that has impaired his legacy. despite the fact that within his ideological evolution, particularly in terms of his understanding of America, it could be considered a logical step. Du Bois recognized the tension, he always had, between America's foundational beliefs, which had been built on ideals of morality and justice and equality, and its insistence on achieving such indisputable objectives via a capitalist system. As his greatest biographer, historian David Levering Lewis, writes of him, Du Bois had, quote, an extraordinary mind of color in a racialized century, possessed of a principled impatience with what he saw as the egregious failings of American democracy that drove him, decade by decade, to the paradox of defending totalitarianism in the service of a global idea of social justice. This contradictory legacy is what led me to this project. This contradictory legacy is why, while I knew a lot about Du Bois for a really long time, I did not know what I was supposed to, what seemed obvious. So obvious, in fact, that no one believed my story when first I told it. So I'm going to begin with the very first page of the book, the introduction, because what happened with the introduction is when it got submitted to readers by my editor for review, the first report came back and the reader said, you know, I love this book, but she has to change the beginning because no one's going to believe it. She really shouldn't make this stuff up at the beginning of a history book. Which was a real problem because it wasn't made up. It's a history book. So this is how it began. I did not know that I grew up approximately 16 miles from W.E.B. Du Bois's birthplace and childhood home until my second year of graduate school. This fact is remarkable to me, not because the majority of residents of the beautiful Berkshire Hills in Massachusetts have no idea that Du Bois was born in Great Barrington in 1868, but because I did not know. Given that anyone who graduated from the public school systems of the Berkshires boasts a healthy knowledge of their famous surroundings, I thought there was little that I, the daughter of two noted local journalists and culture gurus, did not know about this westernmost county of the Bay State. I understood the preeminence of the local music and theater and art scenes. I dutifully attended concerts at Tanglewood and plays in Williamstown. And I knew everything there was to know about Norman Rockwell and Edith Wharton and Herman Melville. But not until I read a random mention of Great Barrington as Du Bois's birthplace in Paul Gilroy's book, The Black Atlantic, and Paul Gilroy's British, did I know of Du Bois's location in Berkshire history. I then asked my parents, only to find that, at least they say, yes, they knew. In fact, there was a terrible controversy over Du Bois in the late 1960s. As my parents offered me their memories of the controversy, I began to realize that this battle over Du Bois not only created a rift within the local community, but also struck right at the heart of Cold War-era politics, the anxieties over civil rights movements in the Vietnam War, and racial unrest in America writ large. They told me about their friends who were supporters of a project to create a memorial, a national landmark, to Du Bois at the site of his childhood home. They mentioned often a fellow named Walter Wilson as someone they knew, a friend, who was particularly involved. They thought the movement had been successful, that a national landmark designation had been granted to Du Bois's home, but they were not sure of the details. I filed away this information, devoting myself to my doctoral work, my first book, and some kind of career track. But when I finally began to research it, I found it a fascinating gambit of study, not only for its larger historical implications, but also because I was learning about my childhood surroundings, talking daily with my parents about the figures that I unearthed in my research, asking my mother to keep a watchful eye on the local newspaper, the Berkshire Eagle, for which both my parents still write weekly columns, for tidbits about Du Bois, and tracking down random bits of information from local sources. And the more I learned, the more disturbing it became to me that it had taken some 25 years to find out that one of the founding voices of my life's work was born just a stone's throw away from my childhood home. My own unawareness, I thought, was likely important to some bigger picture. So then the question, where was Du Bois? Why had he been erased? Why did I know so much about local history, but no idea about him? My hometown was not alone in abandoning of Du Bois. His greatest legacy is his enormous written one, over 4,000 articles, essays, and books. Perhaps most famously, The Souls of Black Folk, which he published in 1903, The Philadelphia Negro, which he published in 1896, and The Paradigm-Smashing Black Reconstruction, which he published in 1935, and I would argue is the single most important history publication in the 20th century. He is perhaps best known for his public disagreements with Booker T. Washington and his central involvement in 1905 with the Niagara Movement, which led to the founding of the NAACP. He was the sole black member of the NAACP's founding administration and served as editor of The Crisis, its publication, for 25 years, which provided him with a forum for his most important ideas on race, politics, and equality. As he traveled the world, including to Russia and China, his writings and teachings became increasingly leftist, particularly around his framings of Pan-Africanism, which espouses an ardent belief that members of the African diaspora need to work in solidarity against the inequalities that they faced, and his concepts on world peace. As his socialist leanings grew, he became disfavored by colleagues and enemies alike, and became a target of the U.S. State Department. In Cold War America, his writings were trashed from public libraries, and the FBI paid a lot of attention to where he was and what he was doing. When he died in Ghana, a state funeral was held there, a celebration of his life and work. Here in America, just about nothing happened. The old man is gone, activists whispered to each other in Washington, D.C., as they prepared for their gathering the next day. Few others noticed. My question became, why? If Great Barrington residents had looked for it in '63 when Du Bois died, they would have found an obituary that was this big in their local newspaper. But a few years later, some other residents noticed. Within a few years of Du Bois' death, residents of the Berkshires, both full-time and summer only, engaged in a heated debate over the legacy of the famed civil rights forefather in Great Barrington history. At question, most directly, was whether or not a memorial park should be established on the site of his childhood home. Nestled in the heart of the bucolic yet culturally sophisticated Berkshires, Great Barrington is part of an internationally recognized regional summer culture that has encompassed a wide array of veritable national treasures. As a local journalist observed, quote, "In Ashley Falls, one can visit the home of Colonel John Ashley. In Stockbridge, there is Norman Rockwell. But in Great Barrington, there is little more than a small metal plaque hidden in the weeds." Indeed, whereas many figures enjoy substantial commemoration from the various museums and historical groups in the areas that exalt them, little notice is paid to the fact that the most important voice on American race relations in the 20th century began his life in Great Barrington, making clear that discussions regarding public memory are also implicitly about public forgetting. Great Barrington greeted the small movement that emerged in the 1960s to memorialize Du Bois with a hostility bred by a Cold War worldview that reduced complicated global politics to a vehement hatred of communism. This view was further tainted by a racist discourse regarding the man and what he espoused. The debate over Du Bois raged through the small community in the late 1960s and 1970s, chiefly orchestrated, again, by Walter Wilson, a prominent yet controversial real estate broker and former communist labor organizer from the South, who, after moving to the Berkshires, took on the Du Bois commemoration campaign as his own. Wilson received support from the Berkshire Eagle, a nationally recognized family-owned daily newspaper, as well as prominent national figures such as Harry Belafonte, Norman Rockwell, Julian Bond, and Sidney Poitier. Opposed to the movement to memorialize Du Bois were the local weekly newspapers, the Berkshire Record and the Berkshire Courier, and a wide array of patriots who defined themselves by their devout anti-communist beliefs, including members of the American Legion, the Daughters of the American Revolution, and the John Birch Society. Perhaps most vocal were members of the local chapter of the Veterans of Foreign Wars. Memorializing Du Bois is like building a statue of Adolf Hitler, said Harold Beckwith, a past commander of the James Modolo Post of the VFW in Great Barrington. The man was a Marxist as far back as 1922, and we oppose a monument to a communist any place in the United States. The comparison of Du Bois to Hitler is without question a startling one. It reveals much about the racial shades that Cold War battles took and provides the incentive to look further into this seemingly impossibly local moment in history in order to unpack the national political debates over race and Cold War politics at a troublesome time in American civic life. Within the controversy, members of the Great Barrington community had to choose sides regarding what the legacy of Du Bois in his hometown was to be. This debate brought with it a torrent of questions. What was the image of Du Bois in the community where he spent the first 18 years or so of his life? How did the red baiting encompassed within the Cold War affect the ability of the Great Barrington community to accept him? How did general attitudes compare to those of the community in which Du Bois lived? What did the battle over the memorial to Du Bois reveal about the racialized mindset of the Cold War, most broadly, and about the mindset and motivations of the people of Great Barrington, most specifically? Why could they not, as a whole, honor their own, if indeed they ever accepted him as such? The process of finding answers delves into the most complicated realms of civil rights, national identity, and concepts of collective memory. In many ways, the battle that took place in Great Barrington over the figure of Du Bois was one of the first encounters in the United States to grapple with civil rights as a legacy, rather than as a series of ongoing political and social movements. To repeat, Du Bois's death took place the night before the March on Washington, arguably the most iconic of the many civil rights spectacles. Wilson's efforts to memorialize Du Bois began to take form almost a full year before the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr., almost inarguably the most iconic of the many civil rights leaders. The debate that Great Barrington was thrown into then, that of how to commemorate, if at all, one of the founding voices of a still thriving and controversial social movement, would prove to be among the first of its kind, as it asked, how should civil rights be remembered? That it should take place in New England, where the abolitionist movement emerged in full force in the 19th century, only further complicates this story. New Englanders are supposed to be the good guys, so to speak. These are the townsfolk who were egalitarian enough to allow someone like Du Bois to flourish in their public space. Yet fast-forwarding almost a century after abolitionism, we find that ideologies of northern apathy and complacence, a feeling of why should we be the ones to deal with this, largely dominate the public discourse, making it difficult to figure out who, if anyone, really are the good guys anymore. So, while the international legacy of Du Bois was secure before his death, and pretty much anybody that you see within this time period who took part in any anti-colonial struggle used Du Bois, his ideas as foundational to their own, he has a problem coming home. But it was not always this way. Great Barrington, in his youth, loved him and supported him, and eventually, as Dr. Bailey mentioned, helped him financially and, in a mentor kind of way, get to college. And it's a very important part of the story to acknowledge, and it's a part that comes from Du Bois's writings himself, and it's a part of his writings that are largely overlooked. Du Bois wrote several autobiographies, and they're all very different, which is an interesting thing for a collection of autobiographies to be. But one of the consistencies in his autobiographies is how he writes about his youth and childhood in Great Barrington. So this section of the book is entitled The Path to Harvard, Education and the Veil. For the most part, Du Bois felt he fit into life quite well in Great Barrington. He had a supportive religious life at the Congregational Church, which was closer to where he and his mother lived than the Episcopal Church that the majority of his family attended. At church, where he thinks he and his mother were likely the, quote, only colored communicants, he felt, quote, absolutely no discrimination, and I do not think there was any, or any thought of it. Indeed, there was little that Great Barrington did not offer to Du Bois. Quote, in the ordinary social affairs of the village, the Sunday school with its picnics and festivals, the temporary skating rink in the town hall, the coasting in crowds on all the hills, and coasting is sledding in New England, and the idea of Du Bois sledding is kind of too fantastic to not include. In all of these, I took part with no thought of discrimination on the part of my fellows. For that, I would have been the first to notice. Beyond acceptance in social affairs, specific individuals particularly supported the young Du Bois. Du Bois remembers often in his autobiographies Johnny Morgan, for example, who owned a bookstore in town that Du Bois often visited. Quote, "He became interested in me and very sympathetic. Morgan let Du Bois look at the wares of his store and allowed him to purchase Thomas Macaulay's History of England, all 5 volumes, on an installment plan, not a usual practice in the 19th century. Morgan also helped Du Bois become the local correspondent for the Springfield Republican, the most significant publication in Western Massachusetts at that time, which issued Du Bois's first published works. And he was 16 when he was writing columns for the Springfield Republican. Like the inhabitants of most towns of a similar size in New England, the residents of Great Barrington put a great deal of emphasis on education. As he showed academic ability early on, the town's interest in Du Bois grew proportionately to his scholarly achievement, with widespread attempts to secure his success regardless of his financial resources or his racial heritage. For Du Bois, however, the seeming racial ease of the town became relative. And despite the support he acquired from neighbors and teachers and classmates, it was within the walls of Great Barrington schools, which he describes as simple but good, that he began to first understand what he eventually articulated famously in the Souls of Black Folk as the veil, that which he saw as separating and concealing Black America from white, blocking insight into the problems of race in the United States, and creating a symbolic wall that denied full citizenship. Of his education in his autobiography, he writes this: "In the public schools of this town, I was trained from the age of 6 to 16, and in the town schools, churches, and general social life, I learned my patterns of living. I had, as a child, almost no experience of segregation or color discrimination. My schoolmates were invariably white. I joined quite naturally all games, excursions, church festivals, recreations like coasting, swimming, hiking. I was in and out of the homes of nearly all my mates and ate and played with them at their tables. I was, as a boy, long unconscious of color, discrimination in any obvious and specific way. I knew, nevertheless, that I was exceptional in appearance and that this riveted attention upon me. Less clearly, I early realized that most of the colored persons I saw, including my own folks, were poorer than the well-to-do whites, lived in humbler houses, and did not own stores." It's his intent on education, however, that really solidifies his relationship with his town, because very few graduates from Great Barrington High School were looking at going to college. So because of this, Du Bois found that he, quote, occupied an unusual position among whites in the town. Many townsfolk likely understood their relationship to Du Bois as a way of understanding their own values and worth. How they treated an exceptional young Black man reflected well upon them and their New England ideals, making for a benevolent rapport that bordered on fetish, in that they saw him still as our Negro. His teachers undoubtedly had recognized the tremendous potential Du Bois demonstrated. It's kind of hard to fathom what a high school teacher in a town like Great Barrington in the late 19th century would do with someone like Will Du Bois in their classroom. Yet college was an exceptional pursuit for anyone from Great Barrington, never mind a Black youth raised primarily by a single mother and her expansive family. But it was the death of Du Bois's mother that set him free from his emotional ties to Great Barrington. Even so, he had little means by which he could sustain himself, never mind his education. However, quote, "The town," and this is from his autobiography, "the town in its quiet and unemotional way was satisfied with my record, and silently they began to plan." According to Du Bois, while his family helped house him and find jobs, there were 3 central white men who collaborated on and financially contributed to his future: Frank Hosmer, his principal; Edward Ben Lennet, the principal of the local private school and the superintendent of Du Bois' Sunday school; and C.C. Painter, a Congregationalist minister, who was the father of one of Du Bois' high school classmates. According to Du Bois, Hosmer was likely the one that brought his situation to the attention of the other 2. Years later, upon receiving best wishes at his 50th birthday party from his former high school principal, Du Bois declared that he owed to Hosmer, quote, "more than to any single person, the fact that I got started toward the higher training in my youth." So what happened? How did a town that had so embraced him come to forget him? Most simply put, and it's kind of a vulgar history that states it this way, he died at the wrong time. He lived way too long. The moment of Du Bois's death, that moment was such a politically complicated one. Movements of civil rights were so deeply entangled with issues of decolonization, with the military action in Vietnam, with the splintering movements of Black Power, and of course with the Cold War, that few, if any, could accommodate his late-in-life communist stance within his overarching ode. As he himself writes in his final autobiography, and I think this is my favorite thing that Du Bois wrote in any of his 4,000 publications that I've read, quote, "I would have been hailed with approval had I died at 50. At 75, my death was practically requested." The bigger picture of Du Bois then had been lost, and no one seemed to know how to fit him in anymore. A solution was offered by the leader of the movement to memorialize Du Bois in Great Barrington, Walter Wilson, the kind of character that a historian would love to invent if he had not actually existed. Walter was, at best and worst, very complicated. He was from the South, which means he was an ultimate outsider in a New England town. He was a communist. He had been an ACLU labor organizer in the Deep South in the 1930s, which means he was either incredibly foolish or incredibly brave, or both, because it was incredibly dangerous work. He was a prolific writer, including these horrible plays that he wrote just reams of. He was one of the largest collectors of Shaker furniture in New England, which means he had a lot of cash. And he was a real estate mogul, an entrepreneur, and an incredibly unethical businessman. His lawyer was one of the people that helped me a lot with this research, the Honorable William Simons, who I thank gratefully. And he spent a lot of hours trying to convey who Walter was to me. Walter had no children. His wife died before he did. He left no papers. He was a good businessman. He left no papers. And the final straw, for a long time for William Simons, who went on to become a very high-level judge in Massachusetts, so he had a very successful career, but for a long time Walter Wilson was his only client. But even the reason he had to let him go, despite the fact that he was the only money that he had, was because he had to drop Wilson as a client after Wilson tried to sell a condemned house to a blind man on a lot. So he's a really difficult person to fit into any one compartment. Anyone that you ask in the Berkshires that knew Walter Wilson just kind of smiles, and you can tell that their face says to you, do you really want to know about him? But everyone loved him at the same time. It was Wilson that found the property that had been Du Bois's childhood home in Great Barrington. And it was Wilson who purchased it. And it was Wilson who created a committee and a nonprofit foundation to make it a national landmark. And as the controversy over his plan grew around him, Walter Wilson created the strategy of history that I think is kind of genius, because it's the strategy of history that allows for Great Barrington to try to accommodate W.E.B. Du Bois. And this is from a section of the book called Benedict Arnold's Leg. And you'll see why. As the debate over Du Bois escalated, Walter Wilson himself issued a public statement on March 7, 1968, in the form of a letter to the editor of the Eagle, to clarify his position regarding what he cleverly dubbed as the, quote, fascinating, fast-growing Berkshire monument industry. With it, he firmly entrenched the idea to commemorate Du Bois within the long-standing American tradition of public commemoration, understanding that negotiations would have to take place among a memorial, its local audience, and its broader historical context. Wilson's understanding, in his letter, Wilson claimed that he first got the idea for a memorial to Du Bois after visiting the National Historical Park in nearby Saratoga, New York, and that's about 45 minutes from Great Barrington, that commemorates the critical American victory over the British in 1777. Wilson was particularly struck by the monument to Benedict Arnold's leg. The monument sits on the site where Arnold was wounded during the Battle of Freeman's Farm, during which he skillfully led his men in a charge against the British, but was severely wounded in the process. He lived, of course, to turn his reputation from that of war hero to traitor, attempting to give the keys of West Point to the British and becoming the ultimate symbol of treason. Wilson was struck by the memorial because he felt that it recognized Arnold's service before he became a traitor. Quote, Maybe here we have found a sensible formula to use when erecting monuments. How much of a body would I give to this or that great one? Arnold got a leg. Who should have a whole body? I couldn't think of a single example. None of my heroes rated a full, perfect body from head to toenail. Not even FDR and JFK. The county is full of complete statues. To many leaders of the original Ku Klux Klan, for example, in public places all over the South and in Washington, D.C. But do the favored ones really rate perfection? Wilson wrote that he decided to focus on civil rights figures using what he called the Benedict Arnold leg formula. Thinking about notables such as the always mentioned Mumbet Freeman, Crispus Attucks, a man of African heritage shot and killed in 1770, which made him the first casualty of the Boston Massacre, abolitionist Charles Sumner, Thaddeus Stevens, the anti-slavery congressman, and Robert Gould Shaw, the white leader of the entirely black Massachusetts 54th Regiment during the Civil War, which was made famous by Robert Lowell's 1960 poem for the Union Dead, and then again by Denzel Washington, I realize. Wilson then wrote that his thoughts rested on, quote, the two great modern names. How much of a whole body on a statue should Booker T. Washington have? Wilson asked, wondering whether Washington deserved his many honors. Wilson was concerned about who had embraced Washington's legacy, noting that, quote, the lily-white Virginia legislature purchased his birthplace and erected a replica of the Washington cabin home on it, and that the U.S. government had spent a great deal of money on turning the homestead into a national historic site in order to perpetuate the ideals of this influential man. The campaign to turn Washington's birthplace into a place of national importance had, according to Wilson, the full support of, quote, the Southern racist members of Congress who were using the white exploiter prerogative of picking and honoring Negro leaders. The other name, according to Wilson, was that of, quote, the man who almost single-handedly destroyed the BTW influence, W.E.B. Du Bois, a modern Negro and American leader. Wilson called Du Bois one of the few Renaissance men in the United States, a poet, a playwright, educator, historian, editor, novelist, activist. Washington's ideals, argued Wilson, were dead before Washington himself was. Yet the influence of Du Bois is just beginning. And yet, pointed out Wilson, there was no monument to the great man. He asked the residents of Berkshire County that if they were to apply the Benedict Arnold leg formula, would they give Du Bois merely a little toe? Would you leave off one leg, or two, or both arms, Wilson asked. If so, take care to greatly enlarge his heart and his brain. Wilson maintained that it was Du Bois he thought of while looking at the monument in Saratoga to Arnold's leg, thinking of the lack of presence in Berkshire County that its greatest resident had, and finding the reason to be of the most disturbing nature. And I'm going to read the rest of his letter to the editor because I think he deserves that. None of the beautiful books about our Purple Hills ever mentioned him, and he was not found worthy of mention among the names of men and women praised beyond measure in Chamber of Commerce and Tourist Bureau publications. Since this goes way back to the time when he became a nominal communist, even takes in the 1920s and 1930s when he was a leading anti-communist. What was the reason for the insulting ignoring? It was because he was black, of course. I left the Saratoga Park resolved to help make amends to Du Bois and the Negro people if ever opportunity offered. I'd confound the John Birchers, the DAR, and the racist individuals who hate and should hate W.E.B. Du Bois. Unlike Washington, he made the proper friends, and most important perhaps, the proper unforgiving enemies. Why not? He fought him alive and he fights him dead. So last spring when I saw a for sale sign on the old Du Bois childhood home site, I put down a heavy deposit, signed a contract, and bought 5 acres for $5,000. Then I went to see my friend and summer neighbor, Dr. Edmund Gordon, and told him what I had so rashly done. In his quiet way, he said, put me down for half the costs and expenses. I put in the rest, and the deed was done. We decided to put together a national committee of sponsors and offer the site to the Commonwealth. This is the extent of our subversive intent. If it be treason, I confess publicly and unrepentantly. In the conclusion of his letter then, a letter that began lightly with this story to the National Historic Site, Wilson praised Du Bois for having the right kind of enemies, enemies that no one with a progressive worldview would want as friends. He also directly addressed those who opposed a memorial to Du Bois, not as patriots fighting against communists, but as racists fighting a tribute to a black man. So I'm going to sum it up, but it doesn't mean you shouldn't get the book and read it. The good news. The Memorial Committee succeeds. The national landmark is established. The bad news. As soon as that happens, Du Bois is then forgotten again in Great Barrington. In 2004, for example, and it's one of those things that just when you think you're finished writing a book, something like this happens, a proposal to name the town's new elementary school after him became a debate, yet again, over communism versus democracy. And as the school naming debate began to unfold, it was almost hard to believe, and I'm just going to read briefly from what happened at that point. In 2004, at a meeting of the school committee of the Berkshire Hills Regional School District, local historian Bernard Drew publicly raised the idea of naming a local school for Du Bois. The lengthy and at times heated debate that followed Drew's suggestion rang all too familiar to those who had been part of the movement to honor Du Bois some 35 years earlier. Yet again, Du Bois exemplified how history is generated and recreated at the most local and personal of levels by people passionately determined for their voices and thus their ways of remembering to be heard. The naming of schools for figures of historic note has been a quietly controversial practice for some time in the United States. The decision to name a library, for example, after a past president or a past civil rights figure often has had more to do with the location of the library, is it in a black neighborhood, than with the figure, him or herself. In the American South, for example, the legacy of the Confederacy, which frequently rears its head with issues such as the Georgia state flag, has become a question for schools. According to the National Center for Education Statistics, there are 19 public schools below the Mason-Dixon line named for Robert E. Lee, 9 for Stonewall Jackson, and 5 for Jefferson Davis. Jeb Stuart, Turner Ashby, and George Edward Pickett all have at least one school that I could find named for them. Many speculate that the naming of schools for these figures has been an attempt by the white power elite to have the last word in the battles that emanated from the 1954 Brown decision and the decades of school integration efforts, or in the spirit of massive resistance, the lack thereof, that followed. Some schools have taken steps to remove the Confederate legacy from campuses, whether by barring students from wearing clothing that bears Confederate symbols, or by renaming the schools themselves. Louisiana's Orleans Parish School Board, for example, voted to change the name of any school that bore the name of a former slave owner, meaning that George Washington Elementary, for one, became Dr. Charles Richard Drew Elementary. In Hampton, Virginia, in 2003, a battle emerged over Jefferson Davis Middle School when Ernestine Harrison, an alum of Hampton's segregated system, launched a petition drive to rename her alma mater. If I were a kid, argued Harrison, I would be ashamed to tell a friend that I went to Jefferson Davis. One of her supporters, none other than Julian Bond, agreed. If it had been up to Robert E. Lee, these kids wouldn't be going to school, he pointed out. They can't help but wonder about honoring a man who wanted to keep them in servitude. Petersburg School Superintendent Lloyd Hanlon, whose jurisdiction was approximately 80% black, includes Jefferson Davis Middle School, as well as 2 other schools named for Confederates, countered that the name of the school is not the point. It's not the name on the outside, Hanlon responded, of the building that negatively affects the attitudes of the students inside. If the attitudes outside of the building are acceptable, then the name is immaterial. Back in Great Barrington, after Drew's proposal to rename Searles Middle School for W.E.B. Du Bois, debate began to take up space, yet again, in letters to the editor, much as the furor over Walter Wilson's idea for a park had done decades earlier. Unlike the earlier era, though, many of these letter writers favored the idea of naming a school for Du Bois. Sally Harris pointed out that Du Bois's, quote, fond feeling for the town where he was born and grew up testifies to the way he must have been treated here at a time when race relations in other places were far from just or kind. For Harris, by honoring Du Bois, the town would also be honoring itself, just as Wilson had said years earlier, acknowledging the racially progressive nature of Great Barrington's forebears. Rachel Fletcher wrote a letter to the editor that offered the highlights of Du Bois's life, as well as his relationships and connections to the local area. Surely here in Great Barrington, home of the schools he first attended and where his remarkable abilities were recognized, she wrote, we can find it in our hearts to lend his name to a school of our own. A history professor at a local community college pointed out that Du Bois's affection for the area was obvious. From his writings, she wrote, we know that he clearly loved his birthplace. Some letters, however, launched familiar accusations at his memory. One writer opened by revealing that she was, quote-unquote, sickened at the idea of naming a school for Du Bois, and she hoped that his, quote, expatriation would not be forgotten. Although she acknowledged his work as a civil rights leader, she contended that Du Bois, quote, became the very thing this nation has risen above, fought against, and triumphed over since its inception, a communist. Schools, she pointed out, were built with taxes generated by our capitalist economy. She concluded by likening naming a school for Du Bois to naming one for Mussolini, Stalin, or Hussein, figures who, like Du Bois, hated America. So the conversation, whether at open school board meetings or in incredibly violent letters to the editor, indicate that the song about Du Bois has largely remained the same. Du Bois cannot be remembered as one of us because he died one of them. And yet, as I argue in Great Barrington, Du Bois was somewhat always a them, even in the days when he was fully embraced and supported by his boyhood neighbors. So where does that leave us? It leaves us in a pretty familiar place, because the conversation about us versus them continues in a very real way in the contemporary moment, reminding us that history is never about the past. Just as the Great Barrington VFW once compared a statue of Du Bois to one of Hitler, our president has been compared to Hitler with his new proposals on health care in recent months. Indeed, Nazi images of Obama have proliferated in recent months, creating a booming t-shirt industry in a moment of severe recession. And billboards asking, where is the birth certificate, continue to dot America's rural highways. In this moment, socialism has replaced communism as pejorative in chief. It makes one wonder how Will Du Bois, as his classmates at Great Barrington High School called him, might have understood his own life in Great Barrington. It is not a struggle that has been or can be resolved, because just as Du Bois continues to haunt Great Barrington, he continues to haunt America writ large, begging perhaps the ultimate question of memory. How do we memorialize the dead when they refuse, politically, ideologically, culturally, sociologically, to die? Thank you. So Dr. Bailey says it's time for questions. Or not.
I'll start it. Dr. Bass, very good work.
Thank you.
Very insightful. Thought-provoking. I find Dr. Du Bois to be one of our most visible and visible people. When I look through sociology texts, I hardly see any reference to him at all, despite him being, I think, one of our most prolific and insightful, writers. And, his famous quote in terms of the problem of the 20th century, the problem of the color line, we're still investigating that which he said. But the question that I have is toward impressions of Booker T. Washington and W.E.B. Du Bois. Do you really feel that they were that antagonistic toward each other, or were they just sort of looking at a common problem from a different lens?
I think it's probably both. I mean, it's a great question, and it's almost one of those things in history that's kind of accepted, so we never look at it. We see the same thing with Malcolm X and Martin Luther King. People are just so willing to accept that they were diametrically opposed, that when they take a more nuanced look, they see just how closely they were veering towards each other towards the end of both of their lives. I think it's a little different with Du Bois and Washington, and largely that's because Du Bois couldn't suffer Washington, and Washington dismissed Du Bois. I think that they're personal attitudes towards each other were actually quite significant to this. You know, Booker T. Washington is someone that had invitations to the White House, who had a very workable system with Tuskegee that people could see the results of. Whereas Du Bois's idea, Du Bois, even his closest colleagues, had a difficult time hanging out with him. Terribly arrogant man. And part of that isn't just personality, it's just a mind like his, you know, doesn't suffer fools easily nor gladly. And his ideas weren't as tangible as Washington's, I would say. You know, the idea of the talented tenth is something much more ethereal than the idea of Tuskegee. So Washington could pull out statistics and generations of young men coming out of Tuskegee and saying, look what I'm doing. Whereas Du Bois was saying, you know, go to college, do the arts, acknowledge what's going on, don't accommodate. And this was something that took him a long time to do. I mean, he had some accommodationist policies earlier in his life. Like I said, when you write as prolifically as he did, you can almost justify any standpoint of his. But, you know, around World War I, he was saying some very accommodationist things. His essay, Close Ranks, and the crisis that, you know, go to war, and when you come back, everyone will love you, because how can they not? Well, they didn't. Which is, you know, which creates that evolution to go a step farther. So I do think that they were very different. They were different in personality. They were different in their reception from white audiences, from powerful people. And they genuinely had very, very difficult relationships with each other. You know, they were not fellow travelers. And so I do think it was a significant opposition. It was a very significant opposition.
Just out of curiosity, I was a little bit confused. Du Bois, what inspired him to go into communism, and what exactly? I must have missed it. What exactly did he have against capitalism? Because it seems like, you know, both capitalism and communism, which side is, I think, both the same in different aspects. But what inspired him to go into?
There's a couple different things that you can see in terms of his evolution. One of which is his travels. He traveled widely, and he traveled to a lot of communist countries, and the way he was treated in those countries was incredibly influential in terms of what he believed in. And when you read his writings about being in the Soviet Union, and being in China, where he saw, and it was a bit of a blind sight on his part, you know, he saw no segregation, no legalized segregation there. But the other part of it is just how antagonized he was by the U.S. government, having his passport taken away, being followed by the FBI, having the State Department intervene in his life. That after decades and decades and decades of trying to work within the system, you know, the NAACP is not a radical group. You know, they're a group that wants to fight segregation via the courts. It's a very systematized kind of group. They weren't doing sit-ins. They weren't launching any kind of militant actions. And he tried to work within that system for decades. And yet by the time the Cold War is going full blast in the 1950s, the U.S. government is so antagonistic to what he's trying to do on an international standpoint that he abandons it. He doesn't renounce citizenship, but he leaves the country. He joins the party. It's a very symbolic joining of the Communist Party. He's a member for less than 2 years, doesn't attend meetings. Which is why you usually see nominal communist. That's his name. Was he a socialist? Absolutely. He did not believe that capitalism was a workable system for social justice at all levels of society. Because to have rich, you had to have poor. Is exactly as he put it. Yes, sir.
Would you say that Washington was more of a visionary than Du Bois?
Can you repeat that a little bit louder?
Would you say that Washington was more of a visionary than Du Bois?
No. I think they have different visions. I mean, what happens with Washington's vision, I think one historian says that with Washington you have to reap the whirlwind. If he sows the seeds, but when you sow the seeds you have to reap the whirlwind. And that the whirlwind from a lot of what Washington does is the civil rights movement, which he would have been very disapproving of and was as it increased in the part of his life that he got to see. So he lays an economic basis for the kinds of social and political movements that Du Bois envisioned, which would get back to your point about how you can find a symbiosis between the two of them. But I don't think I would use a superlative of one being more visionary than the other.
But
You have a follow-up? Go ahead.
Isn't the only true way of obtaining wealth is through land and labor?
If maintaining wealth is the goal. For Du Bois, it was an idea of equitable citizenship rather than financial gain. So it was two very different perspectives on how that citizenship was to be obtained. Did you need to become part of the economic system, or
Right.
was it owed to you by birth alone?
Right, that's what I'm saying. You're solid.
Yeah. Yeah. Sir.
Just recently I was introduced to an article of The Training of Black Men by Du Bois, and he makes mention to a veil. And I noticed that in your book you also made mention to a veil. Was this a recurring theme?
Yes.
In his works? Because you did mention he produced a lot of works.
He produced a lot of, he would get tenure with that. The veil is in just about all of his writings, whether he talks about it as the veil or not. It was a metaphor that he used to talk about segregation that you couldn't see, that with or without the laws of the Jim Crow South, where he lived in New England, where there were no Jim Crow laws, it still existed, which is why he referred to it as a veil. A veil is, it's ethereal. You can see through it, but it's still a barrier. And that it was this unseeable, unknowable thing that separated white and black. So later in his life, he would refer to it and assume, and this is a great part of his personality, that you'd read everything else that he'd written and you would know what he was talking about. But it's The Souls of Black Folk, which it's a real easy read. The Souls of Black Folk is vignettes. It's a very spiritual book. It's a very lyrical book, and that's where he introduces the concept of the veil and explains where it came from. It's a story actually from his grade school days in Great Barrington. They're exchanging name cards, the school children, which was a very late 19th century thing to do. It's kind of like the 19th century version of a business card, but it was a social exchange. Yeah, and he was participating in that, and a young woman wouldn't give him hers. And that was when he first realized that why she wouldn't exchange the name card with him, and that's what he writes of in terms of first having that kind of alertness, that there was this separation, even within the integrated school that he went to.
Why, you mentioned he was very widely accepted within the white community, he was embraced from a very young age. How did that happen? How was he targeting and elevating in his community, this one child? How did these men take notice of him and mold him? They molded him into who he became, therefore he became this arrogance.
It's good arrogance, by the way. I don't want everyone walking away thinking that Du Bois wasn't someone you wanted to. It was a badge of pride in New England to be accepting. Whether or not you truly believed in equality, and probably very few people in that moment of time. It's post-Civil War. Their identity as being part of the North, as being part of the victors, is very strong. And he was that exceptional. So it's really that equation, which is why when you delve into the autobiographies, and he writes so prolifically about his high school principal and the influence that man had upon him. Very early on, Frank Hosmer said, my God, look what is sitting amongst us. And he truly is. I mean, he's one of the great minds of the 20th century, anywhere. And he was sitting in this small town, and they knew that, and they recognized that very early. And he was a case of Christian charity as well. His mother was abandoned, his family was abandoned by his father. He was being raised by a network within the very small black community. He did attend the white church, which gave him contact with the Congregationalists as opposed to the Zionist church that most members of the black community attended. So there were all these different factors that kind of worked into this occurring.
Let us thank Dr. Bass again. You are invited to join her and others in the Mooney Center Lounge. Dr. Bass did bring some books with her, which she would be happy to...
How would it get there?
Right. In any case, come and join us for some coffee, and I think there's cider and cookies, so please. Thank you for coming. We look forward to seeing you again in the future. Let us thank again Dr. Bass.